Welcome to everybody just joining us. Just give us a moment to admit everybody in from the waiting room, and we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, so perfect. Thank you to everybody for joining us today for this virtual talk. I'd just like to remind everyone to keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you'd like to rewatch this talk or previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube and Facebook pages. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Karen, to you. Her talk is entitled Artists and Their Mentors, Part 2. So thank you, Karen, and I'll turn that over to you now.
Thank you very much, Blythe, our wonderful intern at the Timken. We are going to pursue the second part of Artists and Their Mentors. As I had mentioned before, we have such a great repository of art at the Timken, and what's even more interesting to me is that we have so many artists with their students as part of our collection. So, for example, we have a beautiful Peter Paul Rubens, and next to it we have an Anthony van Dyck, who of course studied with Rubens. Now, as we look at this beautiful Rembrandt, we can recall that Rembrandt had a very active studio in Amsterdam in the 17th century. He came from Leiden. He was a university educated at Leiden, and then he came to Amsterdam, where he set up a main part of his career, and he had a very developed studio and trained many artists, Carl Fabritas, for example. So in general, I just want to talk a little bit about mentorship. We know that mentorship really helps guide young people in their quest for professional life. And it could be artists as mentors, writers, professors. And so that relationship is very special. But what's really fascinating, I think, about artists is that they participate in what we call guilds. And guilds occurred in the Middle Ages from about the 11th to the 16th century. And one of the major guilds, particularly in the Low Country, was called the Guild of St. Luke, the patron saint of artists and also of medical doctors. How did that relationship overlap? It's because in the Guild of Medical Doctors, they also dealt with pigments and materials that artists used. So they kind of lumped the artists into that guild. Now, let's say in 17th century Florence, you would not find the Guild of St. Luke. That was, again, more in the Low Countries. But we did have workshops in the 17th century. And even in the 15th century, for example, the Bellini family in Venice, a great family for training artists. As I mentioned, Rembrandt and Rubens. Sometimes artists just admired other artists' work. Sometimes they participated in their studios. Sometimes they even helped create the works of art started by the principal artists. And we're going to look at a variety of relationships. Now, in the 20th century, for example, we still have these collective of artists working together. If you think about in the 60s, for example, with Andy Warhol and the Factory. If you think about the artist Jeff Koons, who's working today, he is a multi-millionaire with a myriad of art projects going on, and he often has his own students finish his work. So this mentorship and working together as artists has been known since the medieval times and even earlier. Now, we're going to go on to the first really important comparison. So we are looking at the top painting is by Luca Caravaggio. And Caravaggio was Italian, even though the name seems maybe Northern European. And the Piazzetta in Venice is one of our most remarkable paintings. And it was done, as you see, about 1700. Now, who was Caravaggio inspired by? Well, of course, Caspar von Wittel. And von Wittel is a fascinating character. So let's talk a little bit about their relationship and then compare the paintings. So we'll start with the fact that these artists met each other in Rome. Caravaggio was primarily a Venetian painter, and Caspar von Wittel was Dutch. But in 1672, when the French invaded Holland, he fled with his family because he was Catholic, and he came to Italy. So he continued his career in Rome. What do both of these artists have in common? They both really revered each other's work, and you can see the dates are very similar. So it was more of a partnership and influence. Now, Caravaggio was a mathematician, and von Wittel was an engineer. So they were both interested in the principles of mathematics and engineering. In fact, von Wittel was so involved with engineering that he helped create hydraulic apparatus to tame the Tiber River. He was actually asked by the city. What else they have in common is the development of the idea of venduta. Venduta, or views, were really developed by these two artists, so much so that future artists like Canaletto, for example, or Guardi, began to paint these views of Venice and Rome. Now, von Wittel's cityscape is Roman, and Caravaggio's is Venice. So let's recap. They met in Rome. Both artists actually did travel a bit in Italy. Von Wittel, the Dutch artist, did go to Venice, but primarily he worked in Rome. And this is Piazza Navona, and that is in Rome. So we'll start here. And this is a remarkable view of the Piazzetta, the small plaza before the main plaza, Piazza San Marco. And then we have the beautiful St. Mark's Cathedral that was begun in the 9th century. And we have the library built by Sansovino, or designed by Sansovino, and the Doge's Palace. What we're seeing here is a very interesting perspective. It is a perspective from down below. The artist paints from below in the canals and looks up to get his view. Now, because of the artist's interest in mathematics, you can see his magnificent development of perspective. You can definitely see a mathematical element to this painting. This is a fowl market, a bird market, around 2 p.m. It is at the end of the fowl market, and you can see people throughout this piazzetta and into the piazza, and they wear sometimes some rather exotic attire. You see fezzes and turbans, and that's because of the prominence of Venice on the Adriatic as it connected with travel and commerce. So 2 o'clock, the people are resting, and you see the fowl cages, and then you see this beautiful Doge's Palace, and it's filled with colonnades and arcades and detail. We have the library with its campanile kind of cut off, and then we have, of course, the column of Hadrian and the St. Mark's, the winged line, which is the mark of St. Mark's. So you can see that this would be not only a great representation of this part of the city, but if you were traveling, which many people did at this time, and you wanted to capture a little snippet of what Venice was like, this would be a perfect souvenir. And that's why people like Canaletto developed it a little bit later. Lastly, I just want to point out that I talk about this a few years ago. I was in Venice just before the COVID, and I kept looking at this painting in our museum, and I love this painting, and I wanted to compare it with what does Venice really look like. It had been a long time since I'd been there, and of course, there's a lot of actual representation here. There's a little bit of poetic license, but it is remarkably similar. Now, let's go to Caspar von Wittel. He was Dutch, and I mentioned he fled Holland to come to Europe, spent most of his time in Rome. And what does he paint? Well, Pope Pius X had this idea of revitalizing the Piazza Navona, and he shows some really remarkable projects here. So we have St. Agnes Cathedral, named after the a saint who was martyred here, and we have the Pamphile Palace. So this palace and church were being revitalized. Also, we have the Four Rivers Fountain by Bernini. And so this whole plaza is being revitalized, and von Wittel really wants to capture this, not only in this beautiful perspective, but also as sort of an engineering and archaeological and architectural feat. So both show views of Italy, Venice and Rome, and with great detail and with the knowledge and understanding of not only mathematics in this case, but architecture and engineering. So we're going to go on. Now, this is a little more esoteric relationship. And what I say by that is, I just mentioned in the two pairings, one really worked with the other, was inspired by the other, but the Zurbaran and the Coton are a little less clear. We do know that Zurbaran was aware of Juan Sanchez de Coton's work, but whether Zurbaran was a student, that is in debate. But sometimes people are greatly inspired by other artists and not necessarily having to work with them, but to look at their work and to judge their achievements. So in our own Timken collection, we have this magnificent Spanish Baroque painting by Francisco de Zurbaran. And Zurbaran was known for his religious paintings. He often painted with commissions from the church and monasteries and convents and things like that. So most of his work was of a religious nature. We do know that Zurbaran was a brilliant still life painter. However, sadly, we only have a few extant versions of his still life. Probably the most amazing one you can see in Pasadena at the Norton Simon, and I recommend that you do make a pilgrimage there. So St. Francis in Meditation. Zurbaran, like many great artists, Jan van Eyck, for example, painted versions of St. Francis. He was a very beloved saint. He was a saint of the animals and humanity, birds. He was a member of the Mendicant order, a very pious order. And so Zurbaran painted many versions of him. So this oil on canvas, as part of our Timken collection, shows St. Francis in meditation. And he holds the skull, and that is what we call a memento mori. And we see that a lot, particularly in the Dutch and Flemish still lives of the 17th century, a memento of death. And so he contemplates the skull of man. And however, he is in a matter of contemplation. So is he looking at the future of mankind? Is he saddened by the idea of mankind and demise? There's many versions of this, but he does hold this beautiful skull, and he looks in this really quiet, contemplative manner. Both of these artists were inspired by the idea of light. And in particular, Zurbaran had known the work of Caravaggio, but these artists helped develop the idea of tenebrism. You can definitely see that here, which is even darker light. The Spanish Baroque artists were known to have a lot of high contrasts in their paintings. And we definitely see this with the Sanchez de Coton. So they both look at the light, this chiaroscuro as it falls on the saint's face. Also, Zurbaran was known to have a lot of, I would say, a more monochromatic palette, and we definitely see it here. This is not necessarily the case with the de Coton because of this beautiful light as it falls on the melon. So we have a saint in meditative pose, and we have someone he was aware of, Juan Sanchez de Coton. Interestingly enough, the de Coton is in our own STMA, and it's one of my most beloved paintings. I just love this painting. So let's talk about it here. This is also a religious painting. And you might say, really? A saint and a still life? People might say, oh, it's a bodegon, a still life of simple foods. But in a way, this is an altar to the real temporal world and the world of symbolism and spirituality. Why is that? Well, just look at it. It looks like an altar of vegetables and fruit. Why are these objects hanging? Well, a couple reasons. I pointed out a number of months ago that when I was a young woman, I lived in Spain, and I lived in an old Renaissance building, did not have hot water, nor did it have refrigeration. And I was told as I went to the market each day, you might want to hang the vegetables and fruit from your window sill because it will stop spoilage. That's one reason these things could be hanging. Another thing is, by 1609, Galileo had invented the telescope and was looking at the celestial sky. And if you look at the date, you might say, well, 1602 is before 1609. However, there was very great interest in Spain and parts of Europe to really study the celestial heavens and look at the planetary movement and, the movement of stars and planets. And so this was definitely a consideration in this painting. Lastly, Sanchez de Coton was very involved with painting for the aristocracy and the intelligentsia of that time. And he basically thought about this Archimedes hyperbola, which is talking about curvature in mathematics. And so that also might be a little quote here. Look at how he cantilevers the cucumber and the sliver of melon over the ledge of the window sill, showing his virtuosity. Many Dutch artists did the same. The other thing is, look at this light, this tenebrism, the black inky background, and the light as it falls on this beautiful melon. So the relation and the skill, this ultra realism of the cabbage, you can see the folds of the leaf, the little browning of the stem, and the bruise on the quince. He is very much interested in realism. So is this relationship a standard mentor relationship, or did Zubron study in the workshops of de Coton? No, but because de Coton was so famous at that time in Spain, we know that there was an inspiration by just seeing his work. All right, we're going to move on, and we're going to look at another wonderful painting in our Timken collection, and it's by Il Guercino. And Guercino's name really is not his full name. It comes from the idea of, and I've seen it in different descriptions, squint eye and cross eye. He was a poor young man from Italy. Cento is where he was from. And Cento is a farming region. And Il Guercino came from a poor family, impoverished family, and he was not able to get his eye abnormality corrected. And what that is what we have today called lazy eye. Or perhaps he was cross-eyed. The pictures I've seen of him looks like he has one eye that he would squint with to really have a prominent vision in the other eye. And what is his relationship with Guido Reni? Well, they were rivals. So Il Guercino worked in Rome, but he spent a lot of time in Bologna. And that is where he grew to know Guido Reni. Reni was a leading artist in Bologna at that time. And when Guido Reni died, Il Guercino took over his workshop. So this is a different relationship as well. It is a relationship more of a rivalry and taking over for one's, let's say, hidden mentorship, because Guercino really was influenced by Reni. The other thing we know is that both painted some religious and some mythological themes. For example, Guercino painted also images of this mythological subject, Aurora. So first, we'll talk a bit about this Return of the Prodigal Son. And of course, it comes from the New Testament. And it talks about Luke saying we should have, when there's repentance, we have acceptance. And in this case, the prodigal son leaves his home and he goes to seek his fortune, and he spends all his money, and he's redeemed, and he comes back, and his father accepts him, and he decides to forgive. So it is a sort of a meditation on forgiveness. So the father embraces his son, his wayward son, and he asks a servant to prepare new clothing for him and a feast, and will accept him, and he's repented, and this is a beautiful relationship. If we look at the work of Il Guercino, we also see influence of light. Their palette is very similar. The difference is later, we're well into the Baroque here, Italian Baroque, and we know that Il Guercino had studied Baroque masters and classical artists, Renaissance artists, for example, and he develops, I beg your pardon, he develops a much more three-dimensional structural form to the bodies. We see a very well-developed torso, muscular arms, the twisting body, and very sculptural. And then this a little bit of a deeper or placing of the figures in the picture plane, unlike this fresco, which is very close to the surface. So Il Guercino shows a biblical subject. He also painted mythological subjects, and he was influenced by Guido Reni and also took over Reni's studio in Bologna. So let's talk a little bit about Guido Reni. He was a Bologna painter. He traveled to Rome, and he was influenced by early works by Caravaggio. He loved light. And here he paints a fresco in a Roman palace. The Borghese family was very interested in showing their connection to antiquity, and they had many city commissions. They were getting important artists to paint for them. So this fresco was in a summer room of a palace in Rome. Now, what's remarkable about this painting is if you first look at it, it looks like a frame, but this, of course, is a painted frame. It's trompe l'oeil. It fools our eye thinking that it is actually carved, but it is painted fresco. What is the subject matter? Aurora, a mythological subject. Aurora floats on the heavenly clouds, and she brings in the day. And she leads the way for Apollo in his quadriga, which is a 4-horse chariot across the night sky. And the women here are the women of hours, his assistants. And then we have the zephyrs blowing the winds, and this Puto holding illuminated light to guide this procession. And there's movement, and there's beauty, and this use of color, and actually a landscape as we sort of see the perspective of the clouds and the landscape below. Now, is the perspective deep? Not at all. He has a very shallow space here, but again, he uses color and light. They're both interested in light. You see it here on the face of the Il Guercino, and you see the light as it floods into here. But this is mythological, religious, but they were influenced. Il Guercino was definitely influenced very greatly by Guido Reni. And we'll move on. Now, again, in our own esteemed collection, we have a Bartolomeo Veneto. And Veneto paints a beautiful aristocrat, lady in waiting of Isabel d'Este. And next to this exquisite portrait, we have a work by his own Gentile Bellini. And Gentile Bellini was part of the very important Venetian workshop family of painters, the Bellini family. And for example, Jacopo, his father, Gentile's father, and his brother Giovanni, great artists. We also have Montaigne, who married into the family. So it is a great family. The Bellini family is a great family of artists. And Veneto did study. Gentile Bellini was his teacher. And Veneto worked in Venice, in that region around the mainland, around Venice, and he was known to paint portraits. This is his last signed portrait, and you can see this, his signature is actually here. And this is, as I said, a member of the aristocracy she was a member of the court of Isabel d'Este, and it's a remarkable portrait, three-quarter portrait of this beautiful woman. Some say there's been a lot of study through our museum of what is the actual situation of this woman, and it was said that this might have been a posthumous portrait because her face is rather pale and she looks a little ill. She doesn't look, she's beautiful, but at the same time, a lot of the beauty is in this rich outfit that she's wearing. In talking about illness, I just want to make a comment that in this 15th century painting of the Sultan Mehmed II, an Ottoman Sultan, we know that very shortly after, maybe a year after this painting by Bellini was completed, he also died. And if you look carefully at this face, you can see a little bit of a pinched face and not a healthy, robust face. So I just wanted to make that kind of link. So again, we'll go back to our Veneto, this portrait of a lady in a green dress, exquisitely painted, the rich, such saturated color, this red color. She wears a very elaborate headdress with pearls and lapis. And lapis, of course, was very important jewel, semi-precious today, but very important then, and a string of lapis. She has these removable sleeves with satin poking through, elaborate hair pulled back, and an embroidered dress. Now, she holds these gloves, and we first thought that the gloves were definitely falconeering gloves because the aristocracy had a fun activity of training falcons, raptors. However, in this case, the glove is in the wrong hand. It should have been on the other hand, but it does not look like just riding gloves. So I'm going to go along with the falconeering. I think it makes most sense to me. And then of course she has these petite hands with the rings. I always mention this, I think I get a kick out of it, but neither are smiling. And of course, you know that dental care was sort of remiss at that time. Now we're going to go on to the Bellini. When Gentile Bellini was teaching artists like Veneto, he was known as the greatest portrait painter, one of the greatest portrait painters of Italy in the 15th century. However, and early in the 16th century. However, later Giovanni, his brother, becomes even more famous, more preeminent. But at this time, if you had your portrait done by Gentile Bellini, you were important. So why is he painting an Ottoman sultan? It was known that Venice and Istanbul, Constantinople, had a very close relationship. Venice was on the Adriatic, and it had a close connection to Constantinople, or Istanbul as is known today. And Sultan Mehmed wanted to honor the fact that the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople and they were reigning there. So it was in the best interest of the Venetian artists, because Veneto did paint a great deal in Venice, as did Bellini. It was very important that Venice had a great relationship. So Sultan Mehmed knew that Bellini was a great portrait painter, and he said, I want him to come and stay with me in Constantinople, and I want him to paint me. And Bellini agreed. He did a diplomatic mission there. So we see the Sultan in a niche, and there's this sort of arch here. And if you notice, it's very crowded. It's almost like there is no middle ground. There's a foreground with this beautiful tapestry, but there isn't really a middle ground. He's close into this ledge with this beautiful embroidery. And why is that? Well, a couple things. Only about 10% of this painting is extant to the artist. It was repainted. It looked very much like this, but there was a lot of repainting. So that might have affected it. Now, we have the Sultan wearing a turban and a taj, which shows his religious significance and his power. And then we have this bas-relief here, and we have these crowns. Why crowns? Well, there's a lot of discussion about the crowns. We actually have another crown here. Some people say it's the crown showing the power of the Sultan. Other people say, no, it relates to territories around this area. So, and others say it's just decorative. So that I can't exactly tell you what the crowns mean. There's a lot of back and forth in art historical circles, but we'll say maybe it shows his power. And lastly, look at this rich, beautiful robe that he wears. So Bellini, the teacher of Veneto, the Veneto in our own Timken collection. Next, we're going to go on to another fabulous painting in our Timken collection. And this is a late Renaissance Paolo Veronese. And Veronese painted in the area of Verona, which is kind of the mainland where Venice is located. And he, at 14, went to study with Antonio Badile. And so even though Badile was his first teacher, he went on to have other teachers. He was very influenced by many artists, but Badile was his first teacher because Veronese was, as a Venetian artist, very talented. And they knew by age 14 that he needed a structure from an important artist. Now, Badile comes from a family of artists. His grandfather was very famous, and he was known to be a great teacher, but stylistically quite different. If you look at the Veronese, Madonna and Child with St. Elizabeth, the infant St. John the Baptist, and St. Catherine, it is much more three-dimensional. The palette is softer. The light really floods this painting. And there is a kind of a twisting of the body. There's movement implied, not so much with the Badile. And you also see a lot more landscape here. So let's talk a little bit about this particular painting, and then we'll go on to make a little bit of a comparison. So here we have the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus, and St. John and St. Elizabeth look on. And St. John the Baptist is kind of playing with the baby's feet very tenderly. But if you look at the mother's faces, they do not look happy. Why is that? Because we know that later, the tragedy that befalls both figures, the women sort of have a prophecy about it. So they kind of look that way. And here we see St. Elizabeth folding laundry in this beautiful wicker basket. And then we have St. Catherine, and she sits on the wheel of her torment. We know that it used to be that we thought this was St. Justine, but we know now because of the wheel, the kneeling on the wheel, that it is St. Catherine. She is a patron saint of Padua and Venice, and she wears beautiful pearls because she was an affluent individual, and a gorgeous dress with light cascading down the folded fabric. And the baby reaches toward her with love. So Veronese captures exquisite light, a little bit of landscape, and you see this magnificent archaeological, or not so much archaeological, but architectural element here with the exposed brick. And as the light falls on the Virgin Mary. But it's much more three-dimensional, even though the space is really crowded. Now, Antonio Badile, as I mentioned, was the teacher of Veronese, and he paints the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. A curious element about this is how much he knew about Roman architecture, because this is a city of Roman antiquity. And you know that Rome had, and throughout Italy, we have Greco-Roman ruins, and it was very important to these artists to study it. And it's particularly influential to Badile. But he has here a very three-dimensional figure. It's not as, let's say, well-rounded and modeled as we have in the Veronese, but it's definitely sculptural. He's in a slight bow, not a contrapposto, but kind of a slight bow here. And he's pierced with arrows, because that was the first stage of his martyrdom. He was slain with arrows. Diocletian didn't want to hear about his proselytizing, and so he had him condemned to death to be shot with arrows. Interestingly enough, he didn't die. He was cut down, and later by Saint Irene, who cut him down from the pole. But later, when Diocletian realized that he was still alive, I believe he was stoned to death. So very tragic figure. We can also look at how different coloration is for both artists. Now, just because Veronese studied as a late Venetian Ren artist does not mean that he took everything from Badile, but he definitely looks at the structure of the body, the religious subject matter. But again, we have this beautiful view of Rome from antiquity and an angel wanting to crown him as a saint. And he looks with awe at what he's about to suffer. And then these beautiful buildings with great perspective. And he puts his foot on the sledge where the arrows are lying. So Veronese very much was influenced by other artists like Titian, for example, but this was his first teacher. And we'll move on. Now, again, in our own Timken collection, we have the Jacques-Louis David. And the Jacques-Louis David was an important neoclassical artist. Fascinating tidbit of information I would like to tell you is that he was actually distantly related to the Rococo master Boucher. And actually, he did study a bit with Boucher, but he did not want to continue the style of Rococo, which Boucher and Fragonard were known for. He was interested in neoclassicism. And that's why he petitioned Joseph Marie Vienne to be his teacher. And he did study for a time with Vienne, but Vienne said, I'm getting kind of old and you can kind of hang out with me, but I won't just have you one-on-one as a student, but you can learn from me. And in fact, both men received the Prix de Rome and went to Rome. And when Jacques-Louis David, he kept petitioning to win the Prix de Rome as Vienne did about 40 years before. Eventually, when Jacques-Louis David did win the Prix de Rome, his teacher, mentor, Vienne, went with him, and they lived in Italy together for a time and worked together. And what's so important about that is they began to understand the work of Winckelmann, a German, considered the first art historian. Now, one might argue that Vasari, for example, was kind of instrumental in the development of art history. And of course he was, but Winckelmann was interested in archaeology, Greco-Roman ruins, and the power of those archaic schools from antiquity. I shouldn't say archaic, more antiquity. And they were very influential to both artists, but particularly Marie Vienne. So Jacques-Louis David was a supporter of the French Revolution, but he was such a brilliant artist that even though he was thrown in jail, he painted a lot about the revolution. And eventually people like Napoleon Bonaparte said, I don't want to put him to death. He's too great of a painter. So we're going to keep him on. So he went in from the painting in the French Revolution on to painting post-revolutionary subject matter. So portrait of Cooper Penrose. Cooper Penrose was a very wealthy Irish Quaker. And he traveled from Ireland to Paris at the time to have the most important painter of Europe paint his portrait. And David does a brilliant job of that. Why? Well, first of all, he makes a great play for the facial characteristics and the hands. And I've told you this before, that hands and faces are the most difficult aspect of a person to paint, and he does it brilliantly. He creates this triangular form with a light, the chiaroscuro falling on Cooper Penrose, but by situating him lower in the lower on the canvas, he kind of diminishes his, let's say, his importance. And even though Cooper Penrose wanted his portrait done for posterity, he didn't want to appear too boastful because Quakers were not interested in this showing of affluence. So he wants to kind of diminish his position a bit, and Jacques-Louis David understands that. He puts him in this wonderful chair, and he looks like a thoughtful person with this beautiful linen shirt and carefully tailored outfit, but it is not elaborate, and there's really no attributes to suggest that he is of upper wealth. Now, quickly, Sweet Melancholia is not exactly mythological, but it shows probably a young girl who has been thwarted in love, and she's sad, and she holds a dove of peace, but there is a smoke coming from this brazier, and it is symbol of calling for Athena, the goddess of, for the goddess of love. I'm thinking really of Venus, and she wants to bring Venus into the picture and Aphrodite to comment about love, and you have these pretty flowers, and it's very a simplistic version of Greek mythology. So Jacques-Louis David was greatly influenced by him, but you can see this is a just more kind of superficial Winkelmann inspired painting. Now, because of time, I really want to go quickly to our page. Of course, I'm going backwards, and we'll try to go forward. Let's do that again. And we have this amazing Peter Claus. Now, Peter Claus was a Haarlem Dutch artist. He worked in the city of Haarlem, and he was known for painting these breakfast scenes. And this is also not only a breakfast scene, but also smokers' requisites, because these are smoking implements here. I'm hoping to get to that painting. And he was very influenced and studied with Balthasar van der Aalst. And Peter Claus had great artists in his own family, landscape painters, for example, and his style is quite different. But they both worked in Haarlem, and van der Aalst, like Peter Claus, looked at the flower markets. Remember, tulipomania is occurring at this time, this interested in tulips, but their style is quite different. This is done in a much simpler style. We have a very rudimentary tabletop with a crack. We have overturned earthenware jug with a great reflection here. And you can see the Dutch interest in light and realism, because these artists were interested in optical devices and light and science. And then we have the dying fish that are cantilevered over the tabletop. And this indicates not only his skill, but he wants to gain some new clients, so to speak. He does use what we call the vanitas theme, and the vanitas brings us to mind of the ephemeral nature of life. And we see this with Venetian glass, half empty, dying fish, and the smoking embers. Balthasar van der Aalst, again, paints a still life that is much more fanciful and exuberant, and he uses an empty woven basket. We have seashells, which he was known for. We have dragonflies and redemption and rebirth with butterflies, and we have this beautiful Chinese porcelain, which show the importance of the Dutch as traders throughout Europe. They remember in the Baroque, they were the strongest culture in terms of science and military strength, trade, and artistic development. Now, really quickly, I know that we have Blythe here. She wants to see if there's any questions. But lastly, I just really want to quickly show you our Van Ruysdael, the bleaching fields of Dutch Baroque, shows a really great reference to Cornelius Vroom. And we don't know a lot about Vroom. We know a lot more about his father. But look at how closely these two landscapes kind of measure up. These are the bleaching fields in Haarlem, and we see St. Bob's Cathedral, and we see people working in the field and these dunes. And then just lastly, I know that our own Rembrandt, even though he was an amazing teacher, he was taught by Peter Lasman in Amsterdam. So we have two religious figures, Jonah being spit out of the whale, and our own Saint Bartholomew, who was martyred for his beliefs. And you can see this knife that showed that he was flayed alive. Now, I've gone over a bit, and I know that we often have questions. So if anybody would like to share questions, we could put them in the chat, or you can let Blythe know.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a wonderful presentation. So yes, as Karen said, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself now, or you can put them in the chat and I can relay them for you. I don't have a question right now so much as I have a comment. I think, it is really interesting to learn about these artists and their mentors, because now, as you said in the beginning, we think about artists like Jeff Koons and other artists who kind of have a team who sometimes complete the work for them. And it's become really controversial more recently, where I think it's interesting because people don't really understand that this is something that's been going on for so long, where artists and mentors have worked together to kind of create works under, the master's title. And so I think that that's just it's a really interesting concept, and it's interesting to talk about, artists from the past and relate that to how artists are working now, and the kind of controversy that comes up now, which is a little bit funny.
I think that is such an interesting point, Blythe, because there is a lot of controversy. Like, where is really the hand of the artist? And a lot of this, the controversy really develops too in the minimalist, because in conceptual artists too, because, the concept, who was it? I'm trying to think. Sol LeWitt, for example, as a minimalist, he often did not execute his painting or drawings. He would have the concept and then have his students or artists that he was mentoring create the works. So some people say, really, does it have the hand of the artist? And look at these big studios. Some, like in Peter Lossman's example, he often finished other artists' work, and you would see that in many studios. In Rubens' studio, for example, many of his students would kind of finish these large commissions. So because of this relationship, there is some, like you say, and you bring up a good point, this controversy.
Yeah, exactly. Sol LeWitt is a great example of an artist like that who really just writes. He comes up with the concept, and the concept is the art, and he writes the instructions on a piece of paper for his students, who can then put it up in all these different museums and galleries and places like that. Or now Felix Gonzalez Torres, who's an amazing artist, probably one of my favorite artists.
Oh, yes.
Works in that conceptual area as well. And he has passed away now for quite a while, and they're still kind of creating art under his name, which is, kind of a, off the path from where we were discussing in this presentation, but still kind of among the same.
No, because it shows the tentacles that spread out with this one major idea. But no, very, very valid points that you're bringing up.
So I don't see any questions so far in the chat, but I do want to give people just a few more minutes, really, if you have any questions. I know we've been chatting, so I don't want to discourage you from unmuting yourselves. Feel free to chime in with any questions or comments or anything you feel like sharing in the chat, or just by unmuting yourself.
One comment I wanted to make, I hope I'm not interrupting anybody. If you think about just the images, I think I showed 8 or 9 pairings, probably the one to me that really looks like side by side is the Von Whittle and the Caravaggio's. I just think because like their time period was very similar, they kind of worked together. They both have this interest in mathematics and engineering. They chose to do Venduta. So I just think, gosh, they really ran a parallel course. Now, if you look at this, you will see that with Lassman and Rembrandt, there are some, this well-modeled body, this tonality, and they're both religious. But, if you didn't know these artists that Rembrandt studied, Van Rijn studied with Lassman, you might not understand. And particularly if you go back to like the Vroom and Van Rijn, so very similar, wouldn't you say? I mean, just very similar, and not so much here. you can understand Jacques-Louis David moving into the idea of classicism. And here, not so much, the coloration and the three-dimensionality of the forms. But again, this was a very close relationship. And this was a little more abstract in its relationship, but this so starkly and so obviously related. So I just wanted to do a little review.
Are quite similar here.
Yes.
Well, I don't see any questions, so I just want to thank you, Karen, for this amazing presentation. It was really lovely to hear you share your knowledge on these paintings. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And if you quite enjoyed this, we have another one next Thursday at 11 a.m. That docent talk will be titled Russian Icons at the Timken. And so we look forward to seeing you there if you're interested.
Thank you all for coming and joining us. And thank you, Blythe. And see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye. I can never get out. Okay, so do I